destroying a civilization. According to the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they said, and now I'm quoting them, Hamas was careful to maintain the ceasefire. That's their words. Careful to maintain the ceasefire. But Israel reneged on its obligations and refused to gradually lift the blockade of Gaza. That's where matters stood. Hamas continued to be careful to maintain the ceasefire. Israel reneged on its obligations. This was a big problem for Israel, because Israel wanted to attack Gaza, and it needed a pretext. It needed an alibi. It needed an excuse. So what did it do? Not complicated. Israel waited till Election Day, November 4th, 2008, waited for all the American media to be riveted on the result of the election, and then this is what it did. Here I'll quote you from Amnesty International's yearbook. A ceasefire agreed in June between Israel and Palestinian armed groups in Gaza held for 4.5 months, but broke down after Israeli forces killed 6 Palestinian militants in airstrikes and other attacks on 4 November. They created the provocation they needed. There's no dispute about what happened. Hamas was careful to maintain the ceasefire until Israel's border raid on November 4th, designed to provoke, as it did, a Hamas retaliation. But Hamas was being very stubborn. You know those tricky Arabs. You know those tricky Arabs. They kept saying, we're willing to renew the ceasefire. We're willing to renew it. But Israel has to lift that blockade. The blockade, which was a flagrant violation of international law, that was destroying a civilization. Sarah Roy, the Harvard-trained economist, who now works at the Middle East Center at Harvard, the daughter of the survivor of Auschwitz concentration camp, a brilliant and very decent person, who also is the world's leading authority on the Gaza economy. She wrote in December 2008, the breakdown of an entire society is happening in front of us in Gaza. But there is little international response beyond UN warnings, which are ignored. The breakdown of an entire society. And everybody is just watching. Nobody is doing anything. Hamas says, we'll renew the ceasefire. Just lift that illegal blockade. Israel says no. Israel says it has to be an unconditional and unilateral Hamas cessation of rocket fire. And then, approximately 11 months ago today, Israel invades Gaza. Well, what happened during those 22 days? Most people say, if you read the news coverage, there was a war. The standard reference is to the Gaza war. Okay, this is a college audience. Certainly it's able to understand the concept of a war. So is it a fair thing to say? Is it a fair thing to infer? And in order for there to be a war, at a minimum condition, to use the fancy language, a threshold condition for a war is you have to have two sides firing at each other. How many people would agree that's a minimum condition for a war? Two sides firing at each other. Raise your hand if you agree with that. If you don't have two sides firing at each other, it's not a war. That seems reasonable. Well, after what happened in Gaza, the Israelis were very proud. They said, we've shown the Arabs who's in charge. They thought after that July-August 2006 war in Lebanon, they thought that they can push us around. This guy, this head of Hezbollah named Nasrallah, he's going around saying the Arabs aren't afraid of Israel anymore. Well, we taught them a lesson this time in Gaza. We put those Arabs in their place because we won that war. That's what they were saying. But then there was an Israeli strategic analyst, and he wrote Israel's most respected paper, Haaretz. He said, now quoting him, it is very dangerous for the Israeli Defense Forces to believe it won the war when there was no war. In reality, not a single battle was fought during those 22 days of fighting. This is not a war, he said. It is not even a real battle. What happened? Well, the first week began the air offensive in Gaza. And by the end of the 22 days, there were 3,000 Israeli combat missions over Gaza. Every plane came back. None was shot down. None was even harmed. Well, that's not surprising, because the people of Gaza had no anti-aircraft defenses. It took as much courage to fly a combat mission over Gaza as it takes to shoot a fish in a barrel. After the first week, Israel launched its air and ground offensive. What happened in that ground offensive? Well, Israel was equipped with special night fighting technology. Hamas couldn't even see them. They didn't know what was going on. In fact, there was no fighting at all in Gaza. None. You know how we know that? Because after those 22 days, many of the soldiers came forward. And there were several compendia, collections of the soldier testimony. Let me quote to you what they said. Soldier, there was nothing there. Those towns, except for some livestock, nothing moved. Soldier, most of the time it was boring. There were not really too many events. Soldier, I did not see one single Arab the whole time we were there, that whole week. Soldier, everyone was disappointed about not engaging anyone. Soldier, usually we did not see a living soul, except for our soldiers, of course, not a soul. Soldier, go ahead. Ask soldiers how often they encountered combatants in Gaza. Nothing, no one. Soldier, there was supposed to be a tiny resistance force when we entered Gaza, but there just wasn't. There was nothing. That's half the story. There was no one to fight. There was no fighting in Gaza. We never saw a Hamas militant in Gaza. Nothing. That's half the story. The other half, I would want you to see for yourself. Go home and enter, under the Google search, enter the words, breaking the silence. Breaking the silence. And what will come up is a compendium of soldier testimonies. And then, under the search feature, enter the word insane. And you'll see you'll get 7 finds for the word